Hi class, my name is Michaela and I was selected to present on Aristotle. So I just want to let everyone know that before I start my timeline, it's going to be a little bit backwards due to the whole before Common Era thing, so just bear with me. To begin, the image on the left is what Aristotle may have looked like. Based on the various statues created of him, this is still our best interpretation of what this famous philosopher may have looked like. Aristotle was born in the year 384 before Common Era and died at the age of 62 in 322 before Common Era. For a fun fact, I attempted to research to see if his name Aristotle and the word aristocracy had anything in common, and apparently the Latin root of arist translates to best in the English language. During Aristotle's adolescence, Aristotle's father passed away when he was only 10 years old, and therefore his uncle resumed guardianship. To his advantage, the uncle had sent him to receive a formal education and study under Plato at Plato's Academy in Athens. Aristotle remained at the Academy for 20 years, where he prospered as a student, and later he was placed on the faculty of Plato's Academy as a teacher in rhetoric, speech, and dialogue. In the image provided, Aristotle is in the blue garb, centered to the right of his teacher Plato. Thanks to his formal education in the literary arts and sciences, and his late father previously being a physician for the Macedonian family, Aristotle was hired to become a tutor for King Philip II's son, who would later become known as Alexander the Great. After Alexander left to be at his father's side, Aristotle returned to Athens in hopes of leaving the Platonic Academy. However, the position was already filled, and instead he established his own school called the Lyceum Academy with permission of the king. Moving on, Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, and the Macedonian government was actually overthrown. And because of Aristotle's close tie with the Macedonian rule, he feared persecution and fled to an island off of Greece called Chalkis, where he remained until his death in 322 BCE. Throughout Aristotle's life, he had created over 200 thought-provoking and world-changing works. However, after his death, most were unrecoverable and only 31 remain today. His legacy lives on in modern political theory, and his work and theories have become the basis of Western thought and philosophy. And lastly, at some point through Aristotle's years, his works contributed to him being appointed to write the Athenian constitution, taking into consideration his works of politics and Nicomachean ethics. So now I'm going to move on from the biography portion to the more political sciencey stuff in the PowerPoint. In Europe, Aristotle was considered to be the greatest authority and most knowledgeable of all subjects, excluding religion. He studied and wrote analyses on various contemporary topics such as logic, philosophy, psychology, biology, metaphysics, ethics, and politics. One of his greatest works was the Organon, where he basically invented logic. This logic would later be applied in his works related to political theory in The Politics, On Politics, and the Athenian Constitution, eventually creating classical democracy. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle goes into detail about how life for man was intended to be ruled by nature combined with virtue. Through this thought, Aristotle claimed that the role of politics in a man's life must bring out the virtue of all in the community. He believed that citizens must actively participate in politics to become happy and virtuous. However, Aristotle believed that the people did not live up to these standards of the ideal community of virtuous citizens. Aristotle, in his work on politics, describes man as a zoon politikon, which translates not only to a political animal, but a thinking animal that relies on thought and rationalization. It is because of this rational thought that man has a natural drive to participate in politics. Aristotle meant that man naturally will thrive in a state of politics, and their lives gain greater meaning by participating in the polis. Therefore, man thrives by living in a society that is governed by laws and political participation. It is through political participation that man finds his potential and meaning. He concludes this thought on human beings as this natural participation leads to individual virtue. It may not be the easiest life, but it is one that leads to happiness and an overall common good. Man becomes man amongst others. So who was a citizen? Aristotle identifies citizenship with active participation and holding public office. Aristotle defines who he regards to be a citizen in the beginning of Book 3 of his work on politics. In his definition, the people encompassed all citizens that were directly involved in decision-making. Due to his thinking animal theory, he believed in man's natural ability to make rational thoughts that pushed them to participate in the polis. However, given the time period, political participation was not available to everyone. The people, therefore, were white land-owning Athenian males, and from a descriptive perspective, this is considered a democratic process, but from a normative perspective, this categorization is not ideal. However, an issue that Aristotle did not take into consideration was the fact that city-states are places of enormous diversity. For Aristotle, citizens were heavily distinguished from other inhabitants such as resident aliens, peasants, children, women, and slaves, even elderly folks as well. Aristotle clearly defines the role of women in his work on politics, stating, as regards the sexes, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, the male ruler and the female subject, end quote. Aristotle believed that women should be submissive to their husbands and see no higher virtue in any other man other than her husband. Overall, Aristotle's democracy was one for the patriarchs, where women had no political rights and their civic rights were strictly limited, although married women fared rather better in this latter respect than single women. Citation held 2016. Women, therefore, did not have citizenship status, but they were needed to produce citizen sons. Aristotle's political theory states that the state should not have complete sovereignty because this would create a larger gap for power abuses in government. Instead, Aristotle suggests a polity, or a rule by the many, to distribute power and avoid corruption. Therefore, he decided that within a mixed republic, the community would be a sovereign body. Aristotle's politics. Aristotle's thinking can be broken down into favorable and unfavorable categories when it comes to the question of who should rule. Aristotle took a rational thought into his own hands when deciding who should have the power to rule. In addition, he recognized that there were different classes in Athenian society, so he broke down the options carefully, looking at preferred and deviant ways to construct government. He observed that having only one ruler or a kingship would not take into consideration the interests of the people, and it would completely validate his theory of the haves and the have-nots. In this case, only one wealthy person would commit abuses of power and only act in his own self-interest. So Aristotle looked towards democracy, where inclusion and participation of the many would be written into the constitution. Aristotle then understood that if all were to be participants, then there would be too many interests and faction groups to address. He also wanted to prevent mob rule from occurring, so for Aristotle, he believed that the ideal republic would be a mixed republic consisting of aristocracy, or rule of the few. Aristocracy literally translates to rule of the best, and it was Aristotle's acknowledgement that superiors could govern and make laws officially while taking into consideration the interests of the many to provide a common good. Aristocracy would allow an elite privilege to govern off the basis of ethics, reason, and logic. Aristotle came up with one of the earliest models of democracy in his work, The Politics, and within it he came up with an extremely detailed format for how classical democracy should look. Aristotle claimed that liberty is a crucial part of classical democracy and should be implemented within the Constitution as an item that allows rule, but also rules in turn. Meaning that there would be many different needs and interests among a population, and while the greater good should ultimately get their way, the democratic process will look over the needs of the few. This is where citizens have equality through liberty and justice, and where the distinction between the haves and the have-not ends. Aristotle explains this phenomenon by stating, quote, "In democracies, the poor have more sovereign power than the rich, for they are more numerous and the decisions of the majority are the sovereign," end quote. This became the backbone of the Athenian constitution. Therefore, the citizenry as a whole formed the key sovereign body of Athens as a grand assembly. However, to incorporate a mixed republic of aristocracy, a group of higher educated men took on the role to draft legislation and implement public policy. This group was called the Council and consisted of 500 elites, and not one held more power than the other, and these officials were usually elected by the Assembly every year. This way, there was a term limit in place to make sure that there was a limited space for abuses of power, and the Assembly consisted of a minimum of 6,000 persons to review any policy, adaptation, or political transaction. Citation held 2006. From my contemporary cross-analysis between Aristotle's philosophy and today's politics, I wanted to examine Aristotle's theory of the one, the few, and the many. And I'd like to compare that with the American Congress with the newfound diversity within it. So in early November, the United States had a midterm election that altered the perspectives of many Americans. And through the lens of Aristotle, today we would distinguish the one to be the president, the few to be the Senate, and the many to be the House of Representatives. And this structure is similar to how Athenian democracy worked. The few in the Athenian democracy would be the council of 500 elites who used reason and logic to implement policy for the many, who would be the assembly of 6,000 men. And essentially, there would be no one in this case for fear of abuses of power and acting in his own interests. Therefore, the structure is much different now than back in ancient Greece, but the principles of representation are still present. In addition to the structure of government, it is important that we take a closer look at the drastic differences in citizenship who can participate in government. The 2018 midterm election placed 108 women into Congress, with 38 of them actually being women of color. This is a huge step for American democracy because it is opening doors to far more interests in the American community that have never been reached before. It also varies drastically from the ancient Athenian democracy because not only are there women participating in the highest levels of democracy, but they are women of color. If Aristotle were to respond, he probably would be unhappy with our current form of American democracy. Aristotle saw anyone who he did not label as a citizen as inferior, and he would be disappointed not only because of the structure, but also because of the diversity within the structure. And I guess he would also be kind of upset about how irresponsible we are at our voting process and the inefficiency of creating policy. Hopefully this will change with the outcome of the 2018 midterm election, though. And that's it. Thank you.